So the US has 12 or more alien spacecraft, and this is according to military and intelligence contractors, and the sources are from top-ranking intelligence officers. This is actually the first time that something like this has been emitted on like actual mainstream media. So these are very credible sources on a very credible news channel, and they're actually admitting this time, very certainly that they do have alien objects and alien materials. So, very interesting news segment. Top ranking intelligence officers are confirming that we do have at least 12 alien objects within US custody. So, let's jump into this.
In recent reporting, author Michael Schellenberger writes that multiple sources have confirmed whistleblower David Grush's claim that the United States government possesses a number of non-human vehicles. These sources are, quote, either high-ranking intelligence officials, former intelligence officials, or individuals who could be verified as being involved in the United States government UAP efforts for 3 or more decades, according to his reporting.
Schellenberger writes that the individuals said they had seen or been presented with, quote, credible and verifiable evidence that the U.S. government and U.S. military contractors possess at least 12 or more alien spacecraft, some of which they shared with AARO or the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, quote, which AARO has refused to provide Congress. The office reportedly said it has not discovered any verifiable information, and, quote, because it does not have the authority to verify it and may not want to verify it. Joining us now to discuss is Twitter Files author and author of Apocalypse Never, Michael Schellenberger. Thank you for being with us, Michael.
Good to be with you.
So, confirmation, aliens are real. This is exciting. What do you make of the baker's dozen of alien spacecraft that we have?
Well, I think it's worth just pointing out that this is very shocking. The whistleblower in question, David Grush, used a term ontological
It seems
shock,
like the public
which
has
is a
been
little
taking
bit of
this
jargon,
information and
but what he
evidence
means
pretty well.
is that the idea that we are not alone in the abstract is something that everybody, I mean, not everybody, but many people, the large majority of people agree with, that we are almost certainly not alone in the universe. However, the idea that there may already be contact or have been contact for quite a while between the U.S. military and non-human intelligence, non-human life forms is very shocking, and it's shocking for me personally. There's things I kept out of the story that I think were just too shocking and certainly harder to confirm. But I do think it's clear that the conversation about this has progressed from the idea that the Pentagon simply has some videos to a large and growing number of people with reason to know who say that, in fact, there are non-human spacecraft.
That is very intriguing that there's things that you left out of the story. I hope that you'll continue to investigate them. I'm wondering how exactly these sources...
That's pretty incredible that there's things within this story that are so incredible and shocking that they didn't even want to include it. Probably something more or less related to when you have spaceships, you have to have space bodies. So probably more or less something related to the evidence that they probably found within these downed vehicles that are probably just too shocking for us to comprehend. Let's see here.
The large majority of people agree with, that we are almost certainly not alone in the universe. However, the idea that there may already be contact or have been contact for quite a while between the U.S. military and non-human intelligence, non-human life forms is very shocking, and it's shocking for me personally. There's things I kept out of the story that I think were just too shocking and certainly harder to confirm. But I do think it's clear that the conversation about this has progressed from the idea that the Pentagon simply has some videos to a large and growing number of people with reason to know who say that, in fact, there are non-human spacecraft.
That is very intriguing that there's things that you left out of the story. I hope that you'll continue to investigate them. I'm wondering how exactly these sources determined that these crafts were non-human. Was it the material they were made out of, the method of construction? How exactly did they make that determination?
Very good investigative journalism here. They just don't, take the facts. They analyze the facts that are provided.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there wasn't much doubt. There are programs, according to these folks, that exist to not just study these technologies, but attempt to reverse engineer them. There was some, I don't know, disagreement or different levels of knowledge about the success in that. Certainly, the idea had been that there was efforts to try to operate these craft or reverse engineers to create them. There's one very interesting story, which is that a major aerospace
It's like, what do you do when you find a spaceship? Do you go inside? Do you push the buttons? It's like, what do you do with this? Is it going to blow up? Does it have like a self-destruction device like the Predator? Okay, we crashed our spaceship. Now let's blow it up so the humans aren't able to reverse engineer.
This company apparently tried to involve greater civilian scientists and engineers to reverse engineer the vehicles because the stovepiping or compartmentalization that exists really prevents the kind of innovation and sharing of knowledge that's actually essential to being able to achieve scientific and engineering goals. And so there was a very briefly floated idea to involve a larger number of scientists and engineers that was apparently rejected by the Pentagon. So these are, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
There's been a lot of extraordinary claims and extraordinary evidence, extraordinary claims, but not a whole lot of extraordinary evidence. So
at the same time, extraordinary claims, you don't need extraordinary evidence to simply investigate them. And the claim here is that these craft are real physical objects. This is not a mass hallucination, that they exist in specific military bases or in contractor facilities, and that members of Congress could go and actually find these facilities or go and actually make sure they get their way in there and try to find these craft themselves.
So obviously this is amazing that we have the craft at all, but I can't help but wonder, were there pilots of the craft? Do we know anything about that? Is there anything you can say to that effect?
David Grush, the whistleblower, did say on News Nation that there were, in some cases, non-human pilots.
What?
I did have confirmation of that from one of my sources. I kept it out of the story in part because it was one source, and also I felt like I really wanted to establish that there is strong evidence that there are craft, and I didn't want to get too much into what I had been told about the different potential of there being beings. It's a lot of ontological shock with just the craft, and I felt like, let's just give this a minute and let's spend a little bit more time doing this reporting. I would also say I'm not the only person that's interviewing these folks. There are other people in my article. I mentioned former Assistant Defense Secretary Christopher Mellon mentioned at least 4 witnesses. I think he said in his article in Politico over 4 people. I don't know if those are the same people I spoke to. We don't share information with each other, but there's more people that are finding the courage to speak. They're very scared. They don't want to lose security clearance, and they're also worried about retaliation. And David Grush, as you know, the whistleblower, felt like he needed to go to Congress because he was subject to retaliation.
I actually have chills right now hearing that there were potentially non-human pilots that were recovered along with the craft. That suggests to me that these were craft that crashed in some way, and that's how the U.S. military was able to recover them. Is that correct?
I want to tell you a story.
Very interesting.
I used to believe that.
Well, actually, that's that there are cases of that. There are people that say that there were crashes. There's also cases of what they call this a retrieval program. There's also cases, I was told, of craft being abandoned and craft making its way into U.S. military hands in other ways. And so I think that.
And then you start to realize, is there some type of trade-off? Like, how are we getting these spacecraft? Is there a trade-off? Okay, we give you this technology, and then you provide this in return, an even exchange. What is that even exchange? They'll never tell us. We have 12 alien spacecraft. Well, we had to give up something, I mean, they all couldn't have been crashes. So very, very interesting.
It's not just that there is crash evidence, but there's also other mechanisms in which these craft have been obtained by the U.S. military.
So it sounds like, from what you're saying, your contacts are based in the United States. You've talked to military officials, people in the intelligence community in the United States. This figure, 12 or more, is specific to the crafts obtained by the U.S. military. Do we know anything more about potential crafts or pilots globally?
Well, Grush, the whistleblower, said in his statements that there is competition between the United States, China, and Russia in terms of developing reverse engineering these technologies. I should say that was not something I was able to confirm, and it wasn't that people.
So now you're trying to figure out, China, Russia, and U.S., they're shooting down UFOs. They're going after UFOs. They're shooting them down. Why? So they can get the technology. It's a UFO arm race for technology. Very, very dangerous situation.
Disconfirmed it or denied it. It was just that the people I spoke to did not know that if Russia or China had these technologies or similar craft. I would also say, just on a personal level, I felt comfortable doing this story in part because of Grush's whistleblower testimony. Like the people I interviewed, I felt like somebody needed to kind of speak up and say that what he's saying is not unusual, that you can find a fair amount of people that will talk about this off the record, or in my case, not for attribution. I will say I haven't written any commentary about the piece itself. I am planning on writing more about it, but I have actually been interviewing people for several years and only felt comfortable at this point, and in part I felt obliged to share this research and to go back to folks. But I've been.
And this was recently too. This was June 7th. This wasn't a month ago. This was a few weeks ago that they actually came out with this. So it's kind of interesting how they came out with this report kind of around the same time with the Las Vegas incident. So very, very interesting. This seems very methodical, planned with this information that they're providing us.
I've been talking to folks for a long time, in part because you may know I have spent a long time working on nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is a dual-use technology, and it was actually in that work that I started to come across a lot of evidence of UFOs, or what have been rebranded UAPs, but a significant amount of interaction of these UAPs and UFOs, including the most famous alleged crash in history occurred around nuclear weapons test sites and also nuclear weapon sites.
Well, they said something about how the Roswell crash was coincided with some type of atomic bomb right around the same time. So interesting.
Is there any connection, Michael, between this existence of the UFOs or the non-human entities and nuclear research?
There's definitely something going on.
Long history of.
I certainly don't entirely understand. There's, in fact, there's a major book. I've interviewed the author of it, called UFOs and Nukes, that describes many cases of anomalous UFO activity around nuclear weapons sites, but there's also been significant UFO sightings and reports around nuclear power plants. The nature of those interactions suggests that whatever is behind those craft is expressing some concern around these sites. I'm very reluctant to get too far into it, in part because I'm a big supporter of nuclear energy. I think it's the only way to really address climate change and other important environmental issues. So, but nonetheless, nuclear obviously is as a weapon, is a very powerful and potentially dangerous technology. And so it does seem like there is something big going on there. And I would just note, we have civilian control of our military in the United States. And we've now done stories on FBI whistleblowers, and we're very concerned about the role of the intelligence community in encouraging censorship by social media platforms. And for me, even though I have been looking at this particular issue for a long time, we have a situation here where we have a very important whistleblower who the intelligence community's inspector general said has credible and urgent information. We have the DOD's special.
Yeah, it's kind of a scary situation. We have people coming out saying we have a lot of alien technology and a lot of alien, craft and so forth. But it's like, how did we get it? Did they all crash? Is there some type of agreement going on? Is that the reason why this whistleblower decided to come up? Hey, we're receiving technology for something else. Very frightening.
Department on this, which is called Arrow. In April, the director of that program said that there was no credible evidence. The inspector general contradicted that. That now the DOD spokesperson told us and others that there's no verifiable evidence. However, this evidence does appear to be verifiable. You need to go into these facilities and look for these craft. I think there may be resistance, but again, we have civilian control over our militaries. And I think there needs to be a very clear statement from members of Congress, particularly Senators Rubio and Gillibrand, that this is not up to the military to decide what to withhold from us. This is the right of the American people to know what our tax dollars and what our militaries are doing. And if there has been some bad behavior, we know there's been.
So that's basically what it seems like is going on. There's some very bad behavior going on with this alien technology, and people are starting to come up.
Cover-ups. And by the way, I will point out, this is a New York Times story from 1978, New York Times Magazine story about Pentagon covering up of UFO information. So for me, if there's nothing there, and we should keep an open mind that maybe there is nothing there, we keep an open mind at both levels, the military needs to open up. It's way past time for this. It's civilian control of our military and intelligence services. And I'm afraid that we're not seeing the levels of disclosure that I think that we deserve to see. It is ontological shock, but I do think we are grown-ups and we're capable of dealing with whatever the truth may be.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. This is in the public interest. So thank you so much for joining us, Michael Schellenberger, and congratulations on the good reporting.
Thank you for having me.
Then we have some very strange and mysterious correlations and similarities between the Titanic sub-disaster and the actual Titanic cruise disaster when it actually hit an iceberg. So some very interesting perspectives on that. And James Cameron is actually going to provide that as well. It's a little bit of a difficult one to find here. Here we go.
Kick off your 4th of July celebration. Bring the boom with the Titan 50 Mesh E.
Speaking of James Cameron, another person closely familiar with the Titanic.
And then, a lot of people don't know that, I guess it was pointed out a lot online, that one of the victims of the actual Titanic cruise ship disaster was, I guess, one of the victims was Martin Rothschild. And now I guess people are making the connection that one of the board of directors that they recently, not recently, about 5 or 10 years ago, appointed a board of director named what's his name, David Rothschild. So a lot of people don't know that one of the board of directors is actually a Rothschild, and people are also making the connection that a Rothschild actually passed away in the original Titanic incident. So very, very interesting correlations here between the two.
Is the director James Cameron himself, along with his Oscar-winning movie. Mr. Cameron, I understand you've made a number of dives to the wreckage site too. Just give us your sense on what you're feeling right now, looking at these images of the shipwreck that you studied so closely, and now hearing that another tragedy has been tied to the same area.
Well, I've been down there many times, and I know the wreck site very well, as does my friend Bob Ballard. I've made 33 dives. I actually calculated that I've spent more time on the ship than the captain did back in the day. And of course, as a submersible designer myself,
it's definitely a lot more to the story than what meets the eye. Mainstream media is not going to connect the dots. The people have to connect the dots. A lot of strange things going on with this incident.
I designed and built a sub to go to the deepest place in the ocean, 3 times deeper than Titanic. So I understand the engineering problems associated with building this type of vehicle and all the safety protocols that you have to go through. And I think that what Bob said, because I was watching, is absolutely critical for people to really get the take-home message from this, from our effort here, is deep submergence diving is a mature art. From the early 60s, where there were, a few acts.
It's like, when you really think about it, like deep submergence diving, that's like one of the safest, scientific, productions there are. That's comparable to space travel. So they're taking the same precautions and the same safety protocols as you would, sending a spacecraft to deep space. So that kind of just puts it into perspective, this really wasn't supposed to happen.
Accidents, nobody was killed in the deep submergence until now. Is more time than between Kitty Hawk and the flight of the first 747. So if we haven't improved over that period of time, we have improved drastically over that period of time, and the certification protocols that all other deep submergence vehicles, except this one, that carry passengers, especially paying passengers, all over the world in tropical waters, deep coral reefs, other wreck sites, and so on. The safety record is the gold standard, absolutely. Not only no fatalities, but no major incidents requiring all of these assets to converge to a site. Of course, that's the nightmare that we've all lived with.
So they've went to multiple sites before, all around the world diving. The Earth has a lot of water. Isn't it kind of strange that this incident happened near the Titanic out of all the places in the world? Too much of a coincidence.
Since all of us entered this field of deep exploration, we live with it in the back of our minds. But because implosion, as Bob described it, such a violent event, is first and foremost in our minds, the pressure boundary, which is what they call the hull of the sub, that the people go inside, is obviously first and foremost in our minds as engineers. And we spend so much time and energy on that. And we use all the computerized tools available today, finite element analysis. We worked on our sphere for our deep vehicle that went to the Challenger Deep for over 3 years, just in the computer, before we even made the thing. And then, of course, we pressure tested it over and over and over, and so on. So, this is a mature art, and many people in the community were very concerned about this sub, and a number of the top players in the.
And James Cameron is going to do a really good job of pointing out some similarities, some very eerie similarities between this recent disaster and the disaster that happened in the 1900s.
In the deep submergence engineering community, even wrote letters to the company saying that what they were doing was too experimental to carry passengers and that needed to be certified and so on. So I'm struck by the similarity of.
Here we go. This is mind-blowing information. Very ironic.
The Titanic disaster itself, where the captain was repeatedly warned about ice ahead of his ship, and yet he steamed at full speed into an ice field on a moonless night, and many people died as a result. And for a very similar tragedy where warnings went unheeded to take place at the same exact site, with all the diving that's going on all around the world, I think is just astonishing. It's really quite surreal. And of course, PH.
So, it could be a hidden message, James Cameron believes it was, too much of a coincidence.
PH Nargeolet, the French legendary submersible dive pilot, a friend of mine. It's a very small community. I've known PH for 25 years. For him to have died tragically in this way is almost impossible for me to process.
It is certainly haunting to consider that comparison to the Titanic and what happened to the 5 people on board this submersible vehicle. James, I want to ask you, though, since you've been down on these dive missions before, we talked about the safety risks. We've reported on the fact that the people on board signed waivers. They knew that this was dangerous and that there weren't very many other vehicles that could come get them out if something goes wrong. How aware were you of those concerns and those risks before you went down? And is there anything that should be done when it comes to safety in the future?
Look, it's comparing apples and oranges here. I went with a very proven system when I dove at Titanic with the Russian submersibles. They used very, very well understood design methodologies, and they had an.
And those Russian submarines are not a joke either, as well.
Excellent operating record when I dove with them, and they continued to have an excellent operating record, flawless operating record throughout their entire career. I think they're now retired, but I always had great confidence. Now, having said that, I always had confidence in the sub. The Titanic wreck site is a very hostile place. It's a dangerous site to dive. If you think of a typical research dive, you go down and you're really just operating over a bottom. You may be looking for organisms. You may be looking at geology. Hydrothermal vent sites can be a bit dangerous as well. But Titanic, you've got this 8-story, 10-story high structure with overhanging metal structures. It's a twisted mess. You can get entangled. And entanglement was always a concern of ours, but we dove with a 2-sub system. We always felt confident that if one of the subs got ensnared, you'd still have communication, you'd still have life support, you'd still have power, you'd have another sub there that could help you manage the problem. We always felt that we were on pretty safe ground. This sub had no backup. It didn't have a lot of backup systems from what I understand, and it was predicated on what I think of as a fundamentally flawed design principle, which is a carbon fiber hull, which when I first heard about a move toward composite hulls, and this was many years ago, even when I was designing my sub, there was another sub that was in competition with us.
So we're making correlations here, that we're making. So like I stated earlier, David Rothschild became board of directors for the Titan submersible back in 2014. Is this around the same time that they started to make flaws in the design? and start replacing the materials with insufficient materials. Seems like there could be a correlation between when this Rothschild became board of director and right around the same time when the materials started changing and when James Cameron noted, flaws in the design of these submersibles.
Us to get to the Challenger Deep that was operated by a guy named Chris Welsh for Richard Branson, and they had a composite hull. And I told those guys, I said somebody's going to get killed in that sub or in a sub like it. And the DNA of the Ocean Gate sub was in that sub at the time. 2 hemispherical end caps and a carbon fiber cylinder in the center. And I never believed in that because the way it fails is it delaminates.
They should know that. They should know. You have to have engineers, scientists, people that have dedicated their whole lives to this. I mean, this is comparable to deep space travel. You should know if a material is going to work or not. This is almost like common sense.
Have a hull, a pressure hull made out of a contiguous material like steel or like titanium, which is the proven standard, or like acrylic. I have a small equity stake in I think one of the best submersible companies in the world.
So this thing wasn't even made out of metal? Gosh.
Submersibles, and they use acrylic for their hulls, but once again, it's a contiguous material, so you can do computer modeling to see how it'll behave. But this Ocean Gate sub had sensors on the inside of the hull to give them a warning when it was starting to crack. And I think if that's your idea of safety, then you're doing it wrong. You don't, and they probably.
I mean, that's one of the. I mean, everyone should know that. The way that you avoid a disaster is you prevent it. You don't wait for a disaster to happen and then respond. You take safety protocols to avoid the disaster. You don't add those safety protocols once you have a disaster.
Probably had warning that their hull was starting to delaminate and starting to crack. Because as Bob pointed out, it's our belief, we understand from inside the community, that they had dropped their ascent weights and they were coming up trying to manage an emergency.
And to your point, a warning only goes so far when you have the ability to get.
I mean, what is a warning going to do when you're, 1,000 leagues under the sea?
Back to the surface, or there's a backup vehicle there to come help you out of a bad situation. James Cameron, thank you so much for your time. I would like to bring Bob Ballard back in